They laughed when Thomas stood up. They mocked the man they thought was a relic of a bygone era. But as the first document hit the mahogany table, the laughter died a jagged death. Now, the titans of industry are scrambling to pull out a chair for the man they just insulted. The game hasn't changed. It's just been reset. The empire is falling, and the ink is barely dry. Will Haley claw his way back, or is the Tower of Grace the final nail in his coffin? Comment "Justice" if you're ready for the next chapter. If you enjoyed this corporate thriller, hit that like button and subscribe to join our boardroom. Turn on notifications so you never miss a high-stakes reversal. The vault is open. Don't get left in the rain. The sun didn't just rise over the city. It paid its respects to Haley Griffin first. From the 68th floor of the Griffin Global Tower, the dawn light hit the floor-to-ceiling glass with a clinical precision that mirrored the man standing behind it. Haley adjusted his silk tie in the reflection, his movements choreographed and devoid of warmth. To him, the sprawling metropolis below wasn't a collection of souls or stories. It was a complex, breathing spreadsheet, and he was the only one who knew how to manipulate the cells. He started his morning with the ritual of the golden cage, a term he used privately to describe the absolute control he exerted over his environment. He sipped an espresso that cost more than most people's weekly groceries, eyes scanning a translucent tablet that fed him real-time data on the Urban Renewal Initiative. To the public, it was a project to modernize the historic East End. To Haley, it was a simple subtraction problem. By removing 4 blocks of low-yield residential housing, the crumbling brick tenements where families had lived for generations, he could add 3 points to the company's quarterly dividend. People were variables. Their history was merely overhead. "Is the board assembled?" Haley asked without turning around. His assistant, a woman who had learned to breathe silently so as not to disturb his focus, nodded from the doorway. "They are waiting, Mr. Griffin. The champagne is on ice for the signing." Haley smirked, a sharp, predatory expression that never quite reached his eyes. He loved the smell of a closing deal, the scent of expensive mahogany, ozone from the air filtration system, and the invisible tang of victory. He took one last look at the horizon, noting how the shadows of his tower stretched across the smaller buildings like a conqueror's cloak. In his mind, every person walking those streets was a decimal point, a rounding error in the grand calculation of his legacy. He felt untouchable, encased in a fortress of glass and gold, convinced that no force on earth could penetrate the sanctuary of his success. He straightened his jacket, checked his $1 million watch, and strode toward the boardroom, ready to sign away the lives of thousands without breaking a sweat. He was the king of the cage, and today, the cage was expanding. The sterile, pressurized air of the 68th floor was suddenly punctured by a scent that didn't belong: damp earth, old wool, and the unmistakable metallic tang of the city streets. It began at the elevator bank, where the chrome doors slid open to reveal a figure that looked like a glitch in the building's high-resolution reality. Thomas Williams stepped out, his boots, cracked and caked with the dust of 1,000 sidewalks, hitting the Italian marble with a heavy rhythmic thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The receptionist, a woman whose entire existence was predicated on the curation of perfection, froze mid-sentence. Her polished smile didn't just falter, it disintegrated. Thomas didn't look at her. He didn't look at the abstract art that cost more than a suburban home or the security guards who were momentarily paralyzed by the sheer audacity of his presence. He walked with a slow, deliberate gait, his tattered canvas bag swinging at his hip like a pendulum counting down the seconds of a dying era. The shockwave moved through the open-plan office ahead of him. Junior analysts, their eyes glued to flickering green tickers, looked up and felt an instinctive, primal discomfort. It was as if a ghost had walked into a laboratory. Thomas was a living reminder of everything Haley Griffin's renewal initiative sought to erase: the grit, the history, and the stubborn persistence of the uncounted. The security team finally broke their trance, their hands moving toward their radios. But there was a gravity to the old man's movement that held them back. He didn't sneak, he didn't apologize. He navigated the glass corridors with the familiarity of a man walking through his own living room. As he approached the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom, the silence became absolute. The humming of the servers and the distant whir of the city below seemed to fade, replaced by the sound of Thomas's labored but steady breathing. Through the glass partitions, the board members saw him, a dark, weathered shape against the blinding white light of their sanctuary. Haley Griffin, mid-sentence and hand poised over a fountain pen, felt the temperature in the room drop. He looked up, his smirk ready to dismiss a janitor or a delivery boy, but his expression curdled as he locked eyes with the intruder. Thomas Williams didn't wait for an invitation. He placed a calloused hand on the polished brass handle, the grime from his fingers leaving a smudge on the pristine surface, and pushed. The uninvited guest had arrived, and the golden cage was no longer a sanctuary. The laughter of the board members ebbed into a shallow, mocking silence as Thomas Williams finally spoke. His voice didn't tremble. It didn't carry the rasp of the streets or the desperation of a beggar. It was a deep, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate the very glass Haley Griffin was so proud of. "You speak of buying and selling as if the earth itself belongs to the highest bidder of the week," Thomas said, his gaze fixed on Haley with a pity that was more insulting than any curse. "But you are mistaken. You aren't the owner of this city, and you certainly don't own this room. At best, Haley, you are a temporary tenant. And the rent has just come due." Haley's smirk didn't vanish, it sharpened. He looked around the table, inviting his subordinates to share in the sheer absurdity of the statement. "A tenant," Haley repeated, the word tasting of disbelief. "I think the fumes from the gutter have finally clouded your vision, old man. I built this tower. My name is on the deed of every square foot of the Griffin Global District. Every light, every elevator, every soul in this building belongs to me because I signed for them." He leaned in closer, his expensive cologne clashing with the scent of Thomas's weathered coat. "Tell me, did you find a special kind of hallucinogen in your dumpster this morning? Or is this just the pathetic delusion of a man who's lost his home and his mind?" Thomas didn't flinch. He reached into the pocket of his tattered coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed and stained. He didn't offer it to Haley. "My ownership isn't written in the cheap ink of your quarterly reports," Thomas said quietly. "It was written in a pact made before your father ever laid the first stone of this foundation. There is one man who knows the truth. One man who remembers who held the ladder while he climbed." Haley threw his head back and laughed, a loud, sharp bark that echoed off the high ceiling. "Ah, the mystery witness. Is it the street corner preacher? Or perhaps the king of the pigeons?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone, a sleek, gold-plated device that cost more than a mid-sized car. With a flourish of theatrical bravado, he slid it across the mahogany table toward Thomas. The device spun, coming to a rest right in front of the old man's calloused hands. "Go ahead, make the call. Call the president. Call the Pope. Call whoever you want to prove your right to be here. If you can get anyone with a pulse and a bank account to vouch for you, I'll let you stay for the champagne. If not, I'll have security toss you out of the window you love so much." Haley crossed his arms, leaning back with a look of supreme confidence. "The floor is yours. Make the call." The gold-plated phone sat on the mahogany table like a high-tech altar to Haley's vanity. Thomas Williams didn't hesitate. He picked up the device, his rough, scarred fingers looking out of place against the seamless glass and precious metal. He didn't look for a contact list, and he didn't ask for a directory. His eyes drifted toward the horizon for a brief second, as if pulling a memory from the very skyline Haley claimed to own, and then he began to tap out a number. It was a sequence of digits that hadn't been dialed from this building in over a decade, a private, encrypted line that bypassed every secretary, every firewall, and every security protocol in the Griffin Global Network. The boardroom was thick with a mocking, expectant silence. Haley leaned back, his arms crossed over his chest, a smirk playing on his lips as he checked his watch. He was already imagining the story he would tell at the club later that evening, the day a beggar tried to prank call the gods. But as the call connected, the air in the room seemed to thin. The rhythmic, electronic pulse of the dialing tone echoed through the speakerphone, sounding unervingly like a heartbeat. Thomas didn't wait for a greeting. When the line clicked open, there was no hello, only a heavy, expectant silence from the other end, a silence that carried the weight of an empire. "The child has forgotten who built the house," Thomas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a terrifying authority that made the board members shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs. He looked directly at Haley, his eyes boring into the CEO's soul with the cold clarity of a judge. Remind him. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Haley's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He expected a dial tone, or perhaps a confused operator, or the ramblings of another vagrant. He didn't expect the sudden, violent vibration that erupted from his own pocket. The sound was jarring, a specific, high-pitched ringtone that Haley had assigned to only one person in the world. It was a phone that hadn't rung in 5 years. It was the red line to his father, the reclusive trillionaire founder of the dynasty, who had retreated to a private island and cut off all contact with the outside world, leaving Haley to rule the ruins. The blood drained from Haley's face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. He stared at the pocket of his jacket as if a viper were coiled inside it. The board members watched, their laughter dying in their throats, as the realization dawned that the joke had just turned into a nightmare. Thomas slowly slid the gold phone back across the table, his expression unchanged. The connection was made, and the foundation of Haley's world was beginning to crack. The vibration against the mahogany desk felt like a tectonic shift, a low, rhythmic growl that cut through the silence of the penthouse. Haley didn't need to look at the screen to know who was calling. There was a specific weight to this silence, a gravity that only one man exerted. He stared at the glowing device, the caller ID blank, a void staring back at him. When he finally pressed the phone to his ear, he didn't say hello. He didn't have to. The voice on the other end was dry, like parchment rubbing against stone. It was the sound of old money and older secrets, the man who had pulled Haley from the obscurity of a mid-level venture firm and built him into a titan. "It's time, Haley," the voice whispered, devoid of any warmth. "The facade has served its purpose, but the foundations are cracking." Haley felt the air leave his lungs. He had spent years believing he was the architect of this empire, but as the voice continued, the blueprint of his life was redrawn in blood and debt. The revelation didn't come as a shout, but as a quiet, devastating confession. The company wasn't built on Haley's genius or the market's whims. It was a blood debt paid in full. Decades ago, in a moment the history books conveniently forgot, Thomas had pulled the founder from the wreckage of a literal and metaphorical fire. He hadn't just saved a life, he had claimed the future. The company's soul, the proprietary algorithms, the deep state contracts, the very essence of their market dominance, had been handed to Thomas as a ransom for the founder's continued breathing. Haley was never the successor. He was the caretaker of a stolen legacy, a figurehead polished to brilliance while Thomas held the leash. As the line went dead, the city lights outside the window seemed to flicker and dim. The glass reflected a man Haley no longer recognized, a king who discovered his crown was made of glass and his throne was borrowed. Everything he had fought for, every ruthless decision he had justified as visionary, was merely a dividend payment to the man in the shadows. The shattering wasn't loud. It was the sound of a heart hardening, the realization that he was standing on a trapdoor, and Thomas finally had his finger on the lever. The conference room felt smaller than it had 10 minutes ago, the air thickening with the ozone scent of laser-printed documents and cold adrenaline. Haley sat at the head of the mahogany table, his fingers laced tightly to mask the slight tremor in his hands. In the center of the desk, the sleek silver speakerphone sat like a dormant explosive. When the line finally clicked open, the founder's voice didn't carry the usual booming charisma. It was flat, clinical, and terrifyingly calm. There were no pleasantries, no "how are the kids?" just the sound of a man reading a death warrant. "Let's begin with the Cayman reconciliation, Haley," the founder said, the voice echoing against the glass walls. The first blow was a ledger entry from 3 years prior, a ghost in the machine that Haley thought had been scrubbed clean. The founder spoke with the rhythmic precision of a metronome, detailing a $4.2 million discrepancy that had been funneled through a shell entity under the guise of infrastructure licensing. Haley opened his mouth to offer the practiced defense of a complex tax strategy, but the founder cut him off before he could draw breath. "Don't. I have the original wire instructions. You signed them using your private terminal at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. You were alone in the building." The systematic dismantling continued, a surgical extraction of Haley's professional identity. Each violation was presented not as a question, but as a theorem already proven. The founder moved from the offshore accounts to the blatant conflict of interest involving the North Star merger, revealing that Haley had held a silent 15% stake in the acquisition target. The room seemed to grow darker as the list lengthened. It wasn't just about the money. It was the betrayal of the internal architecture, the way Haley had rewired the company's ethical sensors to ignore his own movements. "You thought the complexity was your armor," the founder mused, the sound of turning pages audible over the line. But complexity leaves a very specific kind of fingerprint. By the time the founder reached the third-quarter inflation of user metrics, Haley's face had drained of all color, leaving him a gray specter in a bespoke suit. His career, built on a decade of calculated risks and hidden maneuvers, was being reduced to a series of bullet points in an audit report. There was no room for negotiation, no space for a plea bargain. As the founder read the final entry, a direct violation of the non-compete clause involving a rival firm, the silence that followed was heavier than the accusations. Haley looked at the speakerphone, realizing that the man on the other end wasn't just firing him. He was erasing him. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted with the violent suddenness of a cabin decompressing at 30,000 feet. Thomas didn't move quickly. He didn't have to. He simply stood, his spine straightening with a deliberate tectonic grace that seemed to alter the very geometry of the room. A moment ago, the space had been filled with the jagged, ugly sounds of derision, the sharp barks of laughter from men who felt safely insulated by their own net worth. Now, that noise was replaced by a silence, so heavy it felt structural. Vanderbilt, who had been mid-smirk while swirling a 20-year-old scotch, froze. The glass paused at his lips, the ice clicking softly against the crystal, the only sound in the room. He looked at the documents Thomas had laid out, then back at the man he had spent the last hour belittling. The mocking glint in his eyes didn't just fade. It collapsed, replaced by the frantic, wide-eyed calculation of a man realizing he has been standing on a trapdoor. "I believe there was some confusion regarding the seniority of the debt," Thomas said, his voice a low, melodic contrast to the previous tension. It wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of the room, vibrating with the quiet authority of a predator who has already won. The reversal was physical. Miller, the most vocal of the detractors, was the first to break. He didn't just stop laughing. He surged upward, his heavy leather chair skidding backward against the hardwood floor with a harsh screech. He didn't move to exit, but to serve. His hands, which had been dismissively waving Thomas away moments earlier, now reached for the high-backed velvet chair at the head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the architect of the firm's destiny. With a frantic, fawning urgency, Miller pulled it out, his face flushed a deep, panicked crimson. "Thomas, please," Miller stammered, the mocking baritone of his voice replaced by a thin, desperate tenor. "We were merely testing the structural integrity of the proposal. Due diligence, you understand." Thomas didn't acknowledge the lie. He watched as the other board members followed suit, a wave of expensive suits rising in a desperate choreography of submission. They scrambled to clear the space, whisking away their half-empty glasses and scattered notes, as if trying to erase the evidence of their own arrogance. The man they had called a relic, a fluke, and a footnote was now the only person in the room who mattered. As Thomas moved toward the head of the table, the power dynamic didn't just shift, it inverted. He took the seat Miller held for him, not with a sense of triumph, but with the weary patience of a king returning to a messy court. The men who had been ready to cast him out now leaned in, their bodies angled toward him in a collective, involuntary bow, waiting for a single word that would determine which of them would survive the coming liquidation. The rain in the city didn't fall so much as it dissolved, a gray microscopic mist that clung to the wool of Haley's charcoal overcoat until it was heavy with the weight of a drowned thing. He stood on the corner of Fifth and Liberty, his leather brogues darkening as they soaked up the oily runoff from the gutter. Above him, the glass monolith of the tower pierced the low-hanging clouds, a shimmering needle of wealth and ego. From this distance, the penthouse was nothing more than a halo of amber light against the charcoal sky, a celestial workstation where fates were decided with the stroke of a nib. Haley looked up, squinting against the stinging drizzle, and felt the vertigo of a man who had fallen from the stars only to find the pavement harder than he'd imagined. 30 stories up, the silence of the executive suite was absolute, buffered by triple-paned glass and the thick, hushed carpets of a cathedral. Thomas didn't look out the window. He didn't need to see the street to know the temperature of the world below. He sat at the head of the table where, only an hour ago, he had been an outcast. Before him lay a stack of vellum documents, their edges crisp and intimidating. These weren't the standard corporate filings or the predatory acquisition papers that usually grace this desk. These were the charters for a massive, unprecedented conversion, repurposing the firm's dormant real estate holdings into a network of permanent, dignified housing for the city's displaced. Thomas reached for the pen set that sat in a polished obsidian tray. They were the high-stakes pens, heavy instruments of gold and iridium that Haley had always reserved for the billion-dollar closures, the ones that moved markets and crushed competitors. They felt different in Thomas's hand, not like trophies, but like tools. As he uncapped the fountain pen, the nib caught the soft glow of the overhead recessed lighting. With a fluid, rhythmic motion, he began to sign. Each signature was a hammer blow against the old regime, a permanent redirection of capital from the hoard to the hearth. On the street, Haley felt a sudden, inexplicable shiver. He adjusted his collar, but it was useless. The cold was internal now. He watched a woman huddled in a doorway across the street, wrapped in a translucent plastic sheet, and for the first time in his professional life, he didn't see a data point or a nuisance to be cleared by municipal ordinance. He saw a person who was about to become a neighbor. He looked back up at the amber glow of the penthouse, the light shimmering through the rain like a lighthouse. He knew the pens were moving. He knew the ink was drying on a future that no longer had a place for him, but for the first time in years, the air he breathed felt strangely, terrifyingly clean.